returning back to Spengler then, we continue on with Chapter 6, Macrocosmos, Part 2, Apollonian, Faustian, and Magian Soul. And so what happens in this chapter is that Spengler is concerned in this chapter with the great springtime forms, especially as these springtime forms are expressed in the building of monumental architecture right at the beginning of each one of the respective cultures. And along with that monumental architecture that comes in at the inception of each one of these cultures, a number of other expression forms come into being simultaneously: a new type of writing, a new conception of the book, a new epos or a new mythos, a new world feeling, a new prime symbol. In each case, all of this crystallizes at about the same time, within about 2 or 3 centuries, roughly about the same time. It happens all at once. And in the case of, so roughly what we have is with the classical civilization, we've got about the year 1100, the civilization coming into being. This is the time of just after the Trojan War has occurred, which corresponds in the West to the Crusades. So we have the Crusades corresponding to the Trojan War in that case. And in the Magian civilization, I think the phenomenon that we have there is the wars between the various various types of Maccabean revolts. The Maccabean revolt, the revolt takes place about 160 BC, so it's 2 centuries early to correspond, but the wars between the Romans and the Jews that end in the period of the destruction of the temple in about 70 AD roughly then would correspond to the Crusades or the Homeric, the Trojan Wars, in which there's a great religious sort of war. The values are not economic, they're primarily religiously motivated. Coming into being at about the same time, we have Egypt coming into being about 3000 BC, China coming into being about 1200 BC, the same time as India, 1200 BC, Faustian civilization 1000 AD, and the Magian about the year 0. And so those are the cultures that he discusses in this chapter, and this chapter just looks again at the springtime phase of each of these developments. So then he says that at the beginnings of each of these cultures, we get a unique architectural sense. He makes a distinction between what he calls imitation and ornament. Imitation is the older of the two, and it leaks on back into the pre-culture period of the culture, and it has to do with exactly what it sounds like. With the imitation, children are good at doing this, the imitation of a people or a child or an individual, of the powers that are in the macrocosm. They are imitated through song and dance and play and the creation of art. There's a sense of lyrical joy and life. This has to do with the side of life, the lived side of life, in which art is made in castle and cottage. We have the minstrels singing to the court. This is all the lyrical imitation side of life, which is opposed to the later development that Spengler calls ornament. Ornament has to do and is motivated with initially the cult of the dead, as opposed to life. So this he's translating into aesthetics now, his opposition between world as nature and world as history. The imitation is world as history, ornament is world as nature. And ornament has to do with the creation of a form language that is unique to the culture and which is opposed to the macrocosm. It doesn't try to imitate it. It's actually set up in opposition to it in order to neutralize the world fear. Imitation comes out of desire and love and longing and sexuality and all of that. But the creation of ornament has to do with the attempt to neutralize the world fear. So it's motivated by fear and anxiety in the face of death. And stone is invariably its expression form, just as the domiciles of the living are expressed in perishable media such as wood and adobe. The cult of the dead is invariably linked with stone in some form. So we get this the emergence of an ornamental form language that signifies. Imitation has to do with the beautiful or the ugly, but ornament has to do with that which signifies. It has to do with symbolism. It's more spatial. It's a little bit the opposition evokes the old opposition between nobility and priesthood. The nobility is concerned with the tasks of living, and the priesthood, which is concerned with the laws that organize a society. So this is imitation versus ornament. And each culture comes into being here with its own unique ornamentation language that expresses itself in the opposition between the cult of the dead and the cult of the living. So for the cult of the living, we've got the castle and the cottage. This is opposed to cathedral and temple. Whereas in the castle and cottage, he says, art is made The cathedral and the temple and the pyramid are art. They are great works of art that signify an entire world picture, a cosmos that has come into being. And along with that comes into being a new sense of a new mythos. This is the period in which we get, though the corresponding temple forms for the time of Homer have vanished, because the Greeks chose to build in wood during this period, so we don't have their monuments, but they later surface in the creation of the Doric temple. This is the period of the creation of the Homeric epics, which is homologous with the Arthurian romances, which spring into being about the same time as the Gothic cathedrals. And these two correspond to the writing of the Gospels. This is in the period of the Magian civilization, where the corresponding architectural form is the Pantheon as the first mosque. The world is a dome. And this corresponds in Egypt to the building of the pyramids. And though Spengler doesn't mention it, the corresponding mythos there was first written down in the pyramid texts, which come into being in the 5th century and which are actually older than that. They're oral sayings that have been inscribed into the walls of the pyramid of Unas. And they're written down for the first time out of a fear that that the traditions might be lost, because the Egyptians were starting to realize that the priests were not always practicing the magical rites attendant with the cult of the dead. The pharaohs in the previous dynasty, the 4th dynasty, the funerary rites were already by the 5th dynasty ceasing to be practiced. So out of this anxiety on the part of the pharaohs that the priests would stop performing their magical utterances, they wrote them down on the walls of the pyramid. For the first time we have an ornamentation inscribed onto the walls of the pyramid out of an anxiety that there might be a loss here. We don't have a corresponding for the Mesopotamian civilization. We have these are, though Spengler didn't know about them because they were being dug up in his time, these are gigantic temples that are built. They're big. Later they become ziggurats, but in the time of 3500 BC, these are massive temples that appear for the first time. The so-called White Temple that appears in the city of Uruk, and in the city of Eridu has them, and Uruk and Ur. Gigantic temples begin to appear. Whatever the cult was, the liturgies associated with them we no longer have. They become eventually, they're passed down orally, and eventually they become written down in the 3rd dynasty of Ur, but the corresponding texts are not there. And in each one of these cases, we also get a different conception of, consistent with the new ornamentation language, we get a different writing in each one of these cases. And Spengler doesn't illuminate what they are, but we know what they are. We have the sudden springing into being of cuneiform writing about 3300 BC in Mesopotamia. We have the sudden spontaneous appearance of Egyptian hieroglyphs just before the advent of the 1st dynasty in Egypt, about 3200 BC. We have with the Greeks the writing down of the Homeric epics using an alphabet for the first time. This is in the time of Homer, about 750 BC. Writing comes a little bit late there, as it also comes late to India. And we have the sense of the text for the Egyptians, we recall, was the 1st dynasty scroll, the papyrus scroll. And the scroll becomes the form of the book also used by the Greeks and the Romans. But with the advent of the Magian civilization, just about the same time the Pantheon is being built under Hadrian, we get the book as codex. It's a flat book with a spine, which is the form that we've inherited ever since. And in the case of the Gothic, we get the illuminated manuscripts, which are simply books with windows in them that have been illuminated. And Spengler says that every single symbolism in the ornamentation language signifies something. For example, the Faustian, with the creation of the cathedrals, is the first to use the window as an expression language for opening up to the other world and letting the otherworldly element penetrate and come in. Whereas the corresponding Magian form language, the world is a cavern, the windows are put in grudgingly and they barely illuminate. They add just a slight bit of light, just enough to see, to move around. It's very murky and gloomy on the inside. So the window is not what is desired there. But for the Faustian, the elongation of the window with the advent of the flying buttress that enables these gigantic walls of glass to be created by these cathedrals perfectly expresses this idea of infinite space, and it signifies the prime symbol of infinite space for the Gothic culture. Also at this time, we've got different languages coming into being, but each one of these, the ornamentation language itself, Spengler says, lasts all the way through the Kultur period, and then it begins to extinguish itself at the end of the Kultur period when it has fully been realized, worked out through all the successive phases of pre-cultural, early cultural, and late cultural phase. With the late cultural phase, it moves into an autumn period in which you have the sentimental opposition of classicism and romanticism, which happens in each one of these cases. Classicism is simply a sentimentality on the part of ornament to look back at an ornamental form language that has become archaic and soulless and exhausted. Romanticism, on the other hand, is a sentimental imitation of an imitation practice that is also obsolete. And that signifies the shift with the exhaustion of the ornament language. That signifies the shift from culture to civilization. And the thing that characterizes art in the civilization phase as opposed to the culture phase is that it is no longer inwardly necessary, and it becomes, as a result, very eclectic. It loses its unifying style sense, and it becomes very culturally eclectic. We get the cultural pastiche. Art becomes very patchworky. It borrows from alien traditions. We have Frank Lloyd Wright borrowing from Japanese architecture. We have Whistler borrowing from the Japanese print. We have Picasso borrowing his style language from African art, which then moves and creates modernist art. So we have all these alien style forms, alien languages that come in at the end as a culture is losing the sense of the clarity and pristineness of its prime symbol. It begins to become infected with these other alien culture forms, and you get this eclectic. Art becomes merely a matter of taste. Schools now have given way to individual preference, and then, of course, eventually we gradually see the rise of pop culture, which then submerges even that. And it occurs to me that a perfect book for understanding this in the West is Walter Benjamin's Arcades Project, where he charts this process happening in the 19th century of the creation and shift of Paris from an early culture, provincial early culture center of culture to a cosmopolis. And it's the rise of eclecticism and the consumer society. All of that is mapped out by Benjamin in the Arcades Project. So if you ever want a concrete text that shows this process happening of civilization values taking over the culture values, that's the book to read for understanding that process. So Spengler says this happens to each of the civilizations. They become infected at the end with alien form languages. Now, with respect to alien form languages, we also have the problem of the beginning of the culture, which very often can begin with alien culture forms intermixed with the native forms that gradually have to be purged and sifted out over time. This is a phenomenon that he calls pseudomorphosis, which he also discusses in a bit more detail in this chapter, in which he says that the outstanding case of pseudomorphosis that has prevented us from seeing the native culture forms of a civilization is, of course, the Magian, in which case this is the Judeo-Christian, Islamic, Zoroastrian culture that had to express itself through the form language of the late classical civilization, which lay so heavily over the land that it had to use those culture forms to express the sense of its own inner sense of being as spirit, as pneuma, and the wrestle of powers of light and dark inside the world cavern. So we get the pantheon as a disguised mosque coming into being at about the same time that we get the practice of the use of the drill in creating statues, which is something that was not used or preferred by the classical society, which preferred the chisel. And the drill and the practice of the eyes having holes bored into their right into the pupils to indicate the penetration of the soul by the pneuma. There's a sense of inwardness now, of an innerness that was absent from the classical world. The Doric temple is entirely exterior. It's entirely a construction that deflects and disguises the fact that the interior is not what counts, but it's exterior. It's colonnade, whereas the dome is, of course, entirely interior. The Arabian mosque is very unadorned on the outside, but when you go on the inside, then it becomes a revelation, a whole world of magical powers. He says that the stained glass in the Gothic cathedral corresponds to the use of the mosaic, which is taken off the floor as it was used first in the Byzantines, taken off the floor, put up onto the walls to release the play of magical substances, of gold and light and darkness struggling for possession of the human soul, and the creation of a fairy tale world on the inside of these domes and basilicas that manifest this new world feeling. So the pseudomorphosis in the case of the Magian civilization is very heavy and took a while for that civilization to break free of. You can see this restlessness already in the Maccabean revolts and in the Romano-Jewish wars, but finally, with Islam in the 7th century AD, it breaks out, and a delayed crusade that should have taken place earlier happens with the explosion of Islam.